Hello, and welcome to Fall Through, your source for deep conversations about technology, software, and computing. I'm your host, Kris Brando, also known as Scriptable, and on today's episode, I have Matt and Steve joining me, where we're going to talk about open source and its leadership, and the struggles over the decades with open source leadership. So we're going to get into things like Python and Ruby and PHP and Rust and Go and a whole bunch of other stuff. A lot of it current events that are happening right now. As always, there's supporter content, so if you're a supporter, you're going to get extra stuff. If you're not, you should go to fallthrough.fm/subscribe and sign up for that today. And if you're not following us on social media, please give us a follow there. We love talking to you guys. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, that subscribe button, and that notification bell. Yeah, with that, let's get into the show. And then some intro plays, or some music plays, or something happens. I don't know. I'll figure that out in post.
Explosions.
Boom.
Michael Bay, what was his name?
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, I did just record that intro. We're trying to streamline things these days, make things go a little bit better. But anyway, as I said, we have Matt and Steve with me here. Matt, how are you doing today?
Great. Long week, busy week, but doing good.
Excellent. And Steve, welcome back. You had a nice hiatus.
Yeah,
how are you
thanks. I'm doing good. I've been flying all over the place since I'm finally back home, so that's kind of nice. But I'm also just glad to be back.
Yeah, we're glad to have you back, especially for this topic, because I feel like the person we need to talk to or have on the panel with this thing is someone who's chronically online and has read about all of this.
And been semi-personally involved, as we'll talk about.
Yes, been somewhat deeply involved. But let's start with some background. So as you know, listener/viewer, you probably know, in open source circles, we have various different forms of leadership for the projects we have. You know, you have things like C and C++ that are done via committee, standards committee. And then you have probably the majority of languages and other projects that have what we tend to call the BDFL, or benevolent dictator for life. And this includes languages like Python and Go for a while, and Ruby, sort of. It's kind of complicated. And a whole bunch of other languages. And then there's also ones that had a sort of BDFL organization that transitioned to a foundation like Node.JS. And then you have things like Rust, which I guess was sort of like a Mozilla thing, but now is a foundation thing. And there's a whole bunch of other ones I'm sure that we're going to talk about. So I wanted to just give like an overview of some of these projects and where their leadership kind of struggled or kind of went off a cliff. And I think the most notorious one that we kind of have to start with talking about is Python, and that Python 2 to Python 3 migration. So for those that don't know, Python 3 came out, I think, in 2008? Maybe a little bit earlier. It was definitely in the mid-aughts when Python 3 was first on the scene, when they released the first version of it. And they weren't able to successfully deprecate Python 2 until last year, the year before.
Depends on how you define successfully.
As in, I think most people are now using Python 3.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to the question. It has taken a long time because
it's taken 15 years. And that was I think what Guido was basically like, yeah, mistakes were made in that migration process. But a lot of that came from a heavy direction of the leader being like, hey, we need to do this. And the leadership team being like, okay, we need to do this. And the community being like, maybe we shouldn't be doing this. This is not working. And I think the thing that when I look at the Python 2 to Python 3, and this is a theme for Python 2 to Python 3, also for PHP 5 to PHP 6, that eventually went back to PHP 5, which we can talk about in a little bit. And Go modules and like a whole bunch of other things. It's a lot of wishful thinking of leadership, where they are like, oh, wouldn't it be so cool if our language actually worked like this? And then not thinking about how you get from where you are to where you want to be. Right. So I think that was a big thing with Python 2 to Python 3, especially around strings and Unicode and all of that, but also just massive breaking changes. So do you all have any commentary on that? Did I get my history right for anybody that can correct me?
I mean, I definitely think that like I don't think that you're wrong. I would maybe phrase it in a more neutral fashion, which is like, especially for the Python thing at least, it's like hindsight is 2020, and I think that it wasn't really understood or appreciated at the time how difficult the transition would actually be in practice. And so like that's kind of slightly different. I think there also it wasn't entirely BDFL versus community. Like a lot of the community was also behind the transition to 3. Some people were skeptical, and it turns out they were right. But like, I think that maybe it's easier to frame them as right after the fact rather than at the time, I guess is all I'm trying to say, really.
Yeah, I think of all of the yikes BDFL problems, this was not as clearly a BDFL problem.
Yeah.
But still, I think a leadership failure to some degree.
Misstep for sure.
Misstep.
Yeah. Misstep to failure somewhere in that area.
Yeah. Like at some point you have to like question like, okay, like, how do you extract yourself out of this? And I don't think it was ever figured out.
Well, the thing is that like Python then became the language of ML anyway, and so it kind of is still massively popular. Like Python 2 to 3 did not kill Python in the same way that say Perl 5 to Perl 6 like effectively killed Perl. And so, but that's not because of some intrinsic aspect of the transition going well. It's because of historical accident, essentially, which may be putting a little too much emphasis on the work required. But just like, the point is, Python found another niche and then continued to grow regardless of the like strain of the transition.
Right. Yeah, I think that's very similar to PHP, because PHP actually had a similar transition that it tried to do from PHP 5 to PHP 6. And it was actually around the same time. So this was in 2005, so around the same time. And it had similar problems where the community and a lot of people were like, there were a lot of people on board with it, and a lot of people that are like, this is so backward breaking, so many backward breaking changes that I don't like, how are we actually going to roll this out? And what PHP did is they just decided not to, and they rolled it, and they rolled all the good stuff aside from, the main thing with PHP was Unicode. So they rolled all of the stuff outside of the Unicode changes into a new version of PHP 5 and then kind of continued forward, which did incur some messiness when we eventually did want to move to another version of PHP. And that's why it goes from PHP 5 to PHP 7 because they already started writing books and things about PHP 6. And people were like, we don't want like confusion around that. But it's kind of another example of that same like, oh, oops, we tried to make a big transition, but instead of pushing forward with it, the PHP leadership and community just rolled back effectively and took a different path, which I think is sort of rare for these types of situations as a whole.
Yeah. Ruby underwent a big painful transition in its history, but it happened like well before all of these ones. Like all these ones happened at like a later stage. And so Ruby 1.8 to 1.9 was like a massive change, including rewriting the entire implementation from scratch. And there was also user-facing changes and stuff. And it was definitely painful, but like essentially there was enough community momentum around the transition. And also the transition was a little easier. For example, one of the big problems, as you mentioned in Python, was Unicode, and like swapping strings to have different things, by default became a big problem in the transition, because how are you supposed to know which are the old and new strings? And Ruby had like an annotation per file that let you say like, I'm opting into the new string semantics in this file. And so like things like that allowed for a much more gradual transition, even when it was like normally like a bigger breaking change. And so Ruby was both like younger, plus a little more consolidated, plus made the transition a little easier. And so it ended up being fine. It didn't necessarily feel fine in the moment, but like it did work, and everybody successfully moved over, and like that's like ancient history at this point. Like nobody really thinks about that in the same way that the Python 2 to 3 thing is still like a looming concern, plus also like cautionary tale in living memory to those of us who are not. I'm turning 40 soon, so I'm feeling really old. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's that part of it here is that like this seems to have happened with many languages. Like we've just brought up Python and Perl and PHP and Ruby that have all had this like, oh, we're gonna make these big changes, and then like, oops, like we gotta go back some because, or we gotta figure out a plan here because it's kind of not working correctly. And then of course, as we'll talk about later, this happened with Go modules, and that was a Steam forward ahead approach, much like Python. Thankfully, did not take 15 years to integrate, but we can get to that later because next I want to talk about Node.js, which is, I think, one of the areas where this is kind of a success story in like leadership and how you should do leadership. For those that don't know, Node.js, obviously the JavaScript runtime made by Ryan, I'm blanking on his last name right now. Ryan Dahl. And for some reason, the folks over at Joyent really, really liked Node.js. And so they started writing a whole bunch of stuff with it. And they eventually became kind of, I guess, like the de facto BDFL organization for Node.js, kind of stewarding and shepherding a lot of it. But the view of what Node.js should be by the folks at Joyent, especially our beloved Brian Cantrell, wow, I cannot pronounce people's names today. Brian Cantrell. And the view of what the community wanted diverged quite heavily, resulting in the first IOJS fork from Node.js. But unlike many languages and many communities, they decided to more or less like not just push forward with things and actually sit down and figure out where the divergence was. And that led to Node.js being moved into its own foundation where the Node community could go do what the Node community wanted to do. And I think likely led to a lot of people that were at Joyent going into Rust and finding Rust and being like, oh, Rust is great. This is what we actually wanted. At least that's what I've gathered from what I've heard Brian say on podcasts and whatnot.
I feel like there may be a big gap between those two events, but that is kind of what happened, yes, on a longer time scale. But yeah, totally.
We're compressing a lot of history here. I mean, we just compressed like 15 years of Python anguish down to... But yeah. So, Steve, because you're much closer to this than I am, how's that summary of that history there?
Yeah, I think that one's definitely really great. And also, if you want to hear more about that, Brian has a really good talk called Something as an Expression of Community Values. Totally forgetting the first word, which is kind of hilarious because I gave a whole talk based on that talk about Rust, actually. But he explains that history and like how those things diverged and like what they wanted versus what the Node community wanted and like how all that went. And so it's a really great talk in general about open source and community and leadership and how to deal with these kinds of things. I think the framework is really good for like the way to think about these problems. But yeah, I would say that's definitely like a fair summary for sure.
Yeah, he gives so many talks. We'll figure it out later. We'll try and put it in the show notes. Put a little note here. What do you think the name was?
It's Platform as a Reflection of Values.
Platform as a Reflection of Values. That'll be in the show notes for you, listener/viewer. But yeah, I think that's also where I got a lot of this history from, is because I've watched that talk before. But this is always like one of my examples of like a successful leadership move. And I think probably what a lot of leaders need to be doing if they're leading a project, whether you're like a BDFL or it's like a committee-based thing, your community is what is important at the end of the day and what we should all be focusing on. All right, let's get through some more of these. Rust has had some interesting struggles over the years. I think the big one was when the moderation team, kind of all of them up and quit due to conflicts between them and what was it, the core team? Steve, you know way more about this.
That's correct. As a one party in that conflict on the core team, yes, that was the side. And I mean, I guess do you want to like explain that, because you're probably gonna be way better at this than I am, because I'm much further from it than you are. Yeah, we had a dispute over governance where the way I would frame it is the the moderation team claimed that part of the governance was underspecified and therefore they should be able to do things. And we claimed that it was fully specified and the thing that they were trying to say was a thing was expressly not a thing. And then they got mad about that. And then they ended up all quitting because they were mad about that. And so then that led to a general like crisis of confidence in because like this process took a long time and took up a lot of our time and energy. Instead of productively leading the project, we were dealing with this inter-management conflict. And so that then led to crisis of confidence overall in governance, which led to a bunch of people being like, we're going to do better. And then building another version of the Rust governance afterwards. I will try to remain as neutral as possible and just leave it that way. But yes.
Yeah. So again, another, I guess, a conflict that kind of spilled out beyond the borders of the management team that wound up affecting the language as a whole. I guess it's a way to kind of concisely or compact what is a whole bunch of context down into a small thing there, of course. And then there was the other secondary issue with Rust around IP and trademarks, which I'm also a little fuzzy on, but I remember there was basically they tried to clarify around the usage of Rust and all of that, and then the community read it one way, and that led to some big, like, many a confusion about how one was able to use the trademarks held by the Rust Foundation. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Steve. But
yeah, what I would say to that, so the way I would describe it is the foundation said, hey, we're thinking about changing policy. Here is our thoughts on what we're going to change. What do you think? And then everyone got very upset. And so it wasn't even like this is the policy now, but it was worded in such a way that like was upsetting. And so people then did get like very upset. But I do feel like a lot of people sort of like misunderstood this was a request for feedback. And so negative feedback is a very normal kind of like, when you ask for feedback, it's not just because you want a yes, right? It's because you want both sides of things. And so they obviously did make a misstep with the initial decisions there, but like it was a healthy part of the process for everyone to disagree and for them to come back with something that was better, I guess is all I would say. Like I would argue like while this is like a drama, I would say it's like a healthy situation as opposed to the other ones, which are not as like actually healthy, basically. Right.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think this is another one where it's like, because I remember reading that and I was like, okay, yeah, this is quite the like they're asking, but I guess it's really the wording of it is the challenge here, which is part of what makes leadership difficult is you have to understand how do you word things, not just that you do things, you do the things in a specific way, or you will have backlash. And I think there's a thing that I don't think is really a problem of anybody in Rust leadership. But is the whole let's rewrite everything in Rust. And I think that is starting to blow up in a kind of negative way in some spaces. Like Low Level did a video on this recently about them trying to rewrite core utils in Rust. And
so the thing is that this is not real is the thing. Like basically like nobody... God, even the like canonical example of the place that collects instances of people saying, let's rewrite it in Rust is like a GitHub repo with issues where it's a bunch of people opening random issues for fun. Like I at one point was almost mad enough about this to like do an analysis via the GitHub API. But if you even go look at like rewrite it in Rust on GitHub, a lot of it is people making jokes or people filing issues on their own repos saying, this is the thing I want to do. Like the idea of like outside people invading your project and saying that it needs to be written in Rust is like has maybe happened once or twice, but like the Rust in Linux thing was like led by people inside of Linux that happened to like Rust. The utils thing is like somebody in their spare time thought this would be cool and has been working on it for like multiple years, and then other people thought this would also be cool. Like nobody got mad at the BSD folks for like rewriting the GNU utils in C. But like when somebody else writes their own version of the utils, then all of a sudden people get mad because they want it to be about Rust or something instead. And so like this is just like that that thing has been a thing that people make up, and the people who complain about it exist at a far larger volume than the people who, like, in theory, supposedly actually do this, of which there is, like, effectively none. So
Right.
It is true there is, like, backlash, but it is, like, manufactured backlash by people who don't like Rust for other reasons more than it is, like, a real actual phenomenon, essentially. Because also, like, for one of the reasons why this makes me mad is not just because it's about what's real or what's not, but it's like the utils folks, which for those who don't know is like this like Rust rewrite of core utils, like they have been using this as an opportunity to clarify the semantics of core utils and have been sending, like, when they find divergences from upstream, they've been sending them test cases and patches and being like, hey, did you mean this to be this way, or is this an accident? Like, what's the actual semantic here? And so it's like increased the amount of test coverage in the upstream project. So even if you like don't like the idea of somebody rebuilding new software and you're never going to use it, it has made the upstream project better just by existing. And so, like, that's like kind of, I think, by framing this as this like adversarial thing, like people are missing out on benefits. Like the same people who would complain that Rust doesn't have alternate implementations because alternate implementations help you specify something better, sure get mad when other people make alternate implementations of something. So anyway, mini rant done, but like, yeah.
Unleashed the Steve rant. Yeah, I think this is definitely another area where it is the perception and reality have diverged. Like, as I said, I think it was on last episode, where it's like people have this big belief that PHP is a dead language, and it's just like and people are like, oh, it's having a renaissance. To be fair, it is having a little bit of a renaissance, but also like PHP still runs 80% of the web. Like, you go to a random website, there's a good chance that there's PHP sitting behind that, and that PHP is used to render that. Also, like, Facebook is a giant PHP application, and they wrote their own derivative language to make PHP go faster. But it's like, you know, the perception of people is like, oh, we have all these other languages like Node and all of this, and because of the weird way statistics works, people are like, JavaScript is the most popular programming language. I'm like, that because every freaking website out there has JavaScript. Even PHP run applications have JavaScript for various things because that's the language of the browser. So this is another area where it's like, okay, well, yeah, there's a whole bunch. There are a small number of people that are and have been screaming about we should rewrite everything in Rust, but that is a very small number of people compared to the people that like and enjoy Rust. It's the same thing with the people that are like Go versus Rust. It's just like those are not they're not on opposite sides of things. Yeah. It's not a conflict.
This isn't a sports match. It's fine.
Exactly. But I think that the next three examples we have are I think a bit more of a leadership mess up, clear as day, than anything else. And I think the first one we're going to start with is all the stuff that happening around WordPress. So, listener/viewer, if you don't know, WordPress is a content management system/blog system that runs an absolutely ridiculous number of websites out there, right? People use this like in droves. If you go to some random blog, probably running WordPress. It's a big reason why PHP is so popular as well. But what was it, about a year ago, maybe a little more than a year ago, there was some conflict between the guy that created WordPress, Matt Mullenweg, and WordPress.org and WordPress.com, and another WordPress hosting provider called WPEngine. And that led to, I don't really know how to describe it outside of saying that it's just like a massive improper flex of power by the BDFL for WordPress to basically just kick WPEngine out of the WordPress space. That actually included like lawsuits being filed and courts having to make decisions about things, and including even like taking over like modules, like WordPress modules that were maintained by WPEngine teams, which is unfortunately a theme which we'll get to in a bit. But this was just like a massive issue, and a lot of mudslinging between the different groups of people. And this is also how we discover that you can have a foundation. So WordPress is technically in a foundation, but that foundation is controlled almost singularly by Matt Mullenweg, by one person. So it's kind of a foundation in name only. It's like a foundation in name only. But this, I think, is probably one of the clear examples of just really atrocious leadership at the end of the day. Even if like his underlying problems were correct, the way he's handled everything, I think people kind of agree was just pretty egregious. But it's just like a very unfortunate example of problems that will lead into the Ruby stuff that we'll get into in a little bit. But do either of you have anything you want to say on this one?
I didn't I followed this one like via podcast and whatnot, and the earlier ones I didn't really follow because I wasn't really in those communities. I heard them, third party, like Python, Node, Rust, all of those. This one I followed a little bit more closely, reading the articles and such, and I was just like, wow, our industry like really doesn't know how to be adults. This is like the first time I was like, like that is looking from the outside in, thinking like, wow, these are grown people acting like children. Like that's my real comment on that whole WordPress issue. Like, is this really necessary? And then I look back and I'm like, oh, we do this all the time, don't we? And hence this episode of why we're talking about all this stuff. Like we really just don't know how to act. So that's like my high level opinion. I was never really a WordPress user or in that community, so I don't really have like a more strict opinion on things. So, from the outside in, though, it's just a childish nature that really bothers me.
Yeah.
I feel like your description was fair. I used to write PHP a very long time ago. I was never really like in the extended WordPress universe, but definitely like seemed very like petty and vindictive actions by Matt during the situation. And I think that describing it as a flex is like correct. That's what it felt like from the relative outside looking in. It's just like, it's not a good look when a BDFL kicks a opposing company out of your project for reasons that are like not clearly bad, actually. Like, yeah, so I don't know. It definitely was like unfortunate. There's also a very hilarious direct transition to the Ruby stuff from this as well. So I don't know what more you want to say about the WordPress thing before we switch into that. But
yeah, I'm just trying to grab. There was like a really good article that summarized everything that was happening. Man, I guess the good thing about a lot of this is that so much of it's documented, so it's easy to be like, well, we can't talk about it in depth here, but you can go read about it over here. Oh, okay, here we go. Found it. Perfect. So yeah, I think calling it a flex is probably the main way that you have to describe this, because that's what he did. He really just was like, nope, this is mine, and I'm gonna use it for however I want. And yes, we will get into that with another leader who also had lots of commentary about what happened, which I think is somewhat ironic in how this episode started. It's how we got to actually recording this. So before we get into that Ruby drama, just a quick stop at this podcast's favorite thing to present as leadership we don't like: Go modules. And I won't get too in the weeds with this, because we have plenty of content of us talking about how much this annoys us. But from a leadership perspective, I think this is another example of a leader diverging quite heavily from what the community wants, and in effect killing a beloved community project that people were using, and was in many ways a beacon of like actually coming together. So to just give a brief rehash of this history, Go used to have a whole bunch of different dependency management tools like Go Deps and GB, and there's a bunch of them, like 5 or 6, 7 maybe of them. And the community decided we need to fix this problem, so they put together a committee of people that included some very notable people like Sam Boyer and Jess Frizzell and Peter Bergon, and they worked really hard with all of those maintainers of those dependency tools to basically consolidate everything down into one tool called Dep. And all of those tools basically made all their configuration files compatible with Dep. Everybody moved together to really consolidate the dependency management space into a singular tool. And then the BDFL of Go at the time decided that that was actually just an experiment To be fair, he did call it experiment the entire time. He never clarified what experiment meant. And then, like, unceremoniously one day just said, oh, that experiment's done, and killed dep, archived the repo, and said, this is the other thing that we're going to be doing instead, which is what became modules. And the community was not happy about this at all, because so much time and effort had been put into putting everything into dep. And the leadership and the Go team just basically decided, oh, well, that's not what we wanted, so that's not what we're going to do. Exacerbating this was the fact that modules was not ready to ship, and they kind of dumped it on the community, and the community was like, but this thing doesn't work, and it didn't work for a few years. So also similar to that Python 2 to Python 3 thing, except it had been like if the Python team had decided to stop maintaining Python 2 and was like, I don't know, y'all can go do what you want, I guess. So that's a brief one. If you want to hear more about this, I'm sure there's plenty of episodes of Fall 3 you can go listen to. But if you want us to do like a full, like, in-depth timeline of this, we can do that too. And then maybe we'll stop talking about it as much. But for the record, modules right now is actually pretty good. We've gotten to a place where it is stable. It just took us the 5 to 7 years to do, which is, I think, a theme here. A lot of these communities have settled back into good operating modes, but it just took a long time to get there. And there was a lot of damage done between the leadership and the community because of some of those leadership choices. Matt, Steve, you have anything you want to say on the Go modules?
I mean, even just yesterday, I said bad words about the V2 path thing in one of the Oxide internal chats. Not in a bad way. I was just like, I don't really like this, because when you see like 2 different modules included in like your Go mod, and one's V0 whatever and one's /V2 whatever, like this feels weird. But whatever, that's not a problem. It's just crazy how much damage and how long the damage can stay around from the actions of like poor leadership,
Right.
And poor community too, right? I'm not going to put this solely on just like a single leader or whatever, but if you name yourself, the BDFL or the sole leader of something, then yeah, your actions are going to have a lot of consequences. And then in the community side, like if you're just a toxic community and you're mean to one another and nobody's kind of like, reprimanding you, then yeah, nobody's going to want to be around that. And I guess I'm glad to hear that every community has its problem, right? It's kind of comforting in a sense to say like, oh, it's not just Go, it's not just Rust, it's not just whatever. It's like all of them. We all suck. Okay, cool. Got it. But I don't know. I think we could avoid a lot of this if we just communicate better. I read some of these discussions on the internet. The mailing lists, the GitHub issues, whatever. I read this communication, and my God, a lot of people don't know how to communicate and are very mean to one another, and I'm not saying that in a sensitive way. It's just very like, you're an adult talking to an adult and you still haven't learned how to communicate things properly. You're still like, name calling people and like using disparaging words and statements on things. Like, you can't just focus on the topic at hand and have an actual opinion about it. You have to like name call someone or like meme, right? A lot of people just meme in these things. Like this is not helping anything. You're just making this whole problem worse, and you're making your community look like a joke, So I don't know. To me, it's comforting that it's not just one community, but it's also like really unsettling that so many adults out there act like children. But what are you gonna do, right? That's a different discussion, I guess.
I agree with you that like there's some level of comfort that this is normal, but then there's also it's not okay that this is normal, actually. Like I used to try to get people in open source a ton, and then I kind of stopped, and I never really thought about that. But then I read this tweet that said, my neighbor told me coyotes keep eating his outdoor cats. So I asked how many cats he has, and he says he just goes to the shelter and gets a new cat afterwards. So I said, it sounds like he's feeding shelter cats to coyotes. And then his daughter started crying. And like, okay, if open source is perpetually a toxic pile of people yelling at each other, why are we throwing more people into the meat grinder? Like, is that good, right? Actually? Right? Like, is this structurally? And I think that's like part of, we haven't covered all of the individual dramas and missteps here, but like, if this is the normal state of things, like, it's kind of not okay, actually. The amount of like tears and blood and sweat from people to like make all this happen is like, maybe not necessary. I don't know if we have an existence proof that it's not necessary, but it's like not as like happy, joyful, we're writing software for free that everyone can enjoy the way that it's like often presented as, I guess is what I would say.
I think definitely one of my problems with one of my issues with how this tends to happen is that people get extremely defensive of the leader when these communities like go through these tough things, right? Like I remember for years, like with Go modules and me being like heavily critical of the Go team, people were just kind of like, oh, but look at this other good stuff that Russ has done, or like, look at all these other things. And I'm like, that's not enough though. Like, I don't care if the technical solution came out to be fine. I don't care if we eventually got there. Like, as a leader, your job is not to like eventually get us there and have like this, awful experience in between. It's to actually like lead the community in a healthy way and get us to solutions in a healthy way. And I feel like that is a thing that very few BDFLs have been able to accomplish. And some of them are just like notoriously terrible. Like Linus Torvalds for years was just such a jerk to like literally everybody around him. And I don't know, it seems like maybe he's gotten better, but I don't pay that much attention to the inner circles of Linux. But like, it seems like communities keep having this thing where we just put this person who's probably not really qualified to be leading certainly a massive organization of people, because that's what these are, right? Open source communities are pretty large entities, even if they are not structured as like a company, even if there's not the same sort of power dynamics as a company. But we keep putting people who are technically competent, but leadership-wise incompetent. And then it winds up blowing up, usually several times over. And then like those people wind up leaving. And I think a lot of the time, we as communities never really reckon with what has just happened. Like Russ left the position of being the lead of Go, and no one really talked about. Everybody's like, oh, thank you for all the great things you did. And I'm like, maybe we should start having more serious conversations when people in leadership positions leave, instead of just like profusely thanking them for everything. Because we can't really get better if we don't actually have the tough talks. And it seems like a lot of people, especially in open source, do not want to have the tough talks, which I think leads to these perpetual cycles of us stumbling over the same mistakes over and over and over again.
Yeah. It's a lot of, like you said, defending leadership's every action, which never made sense to me. Like if you can't have an honest discussion about what actually happened and how things were involved, then what are you even doing here? And then we also have the whole, if you don't like it, just leave, or let's just ban that person. Like you're not enabling any of these difficult discussions to be had, and the community is worse for it. Honestly, it's worse for it. And I know it seems nice at first to be like, yeah, let's just, any sort of tough speech or whatever, we're just gonna like let it, we're just gonna ignore it and whatever. But you have to have these tough discussions if you want your community to actually grow. No different than any other relationship or discussion you have. You have to have tough conversations sometimes with your boss, with your spouse or partner. You have to have these conversations if you want to grow. And I never understood the whole defending leadership thing. But I did want to bring up that one of our colleagues, Steve, he wrote this article called "This is Just How We Do Things Now." It's Jay. So I put in the show notes. But he talked about this concept of normalization of deviance, which is basically saying if you have a set of standards that your community abides by, and then you keep accepting behavior that's not abiding by those standards, you're just normalizing it over time. And then the standards that you did have just essentially go away because you've normalized the deviance from the standard. And I thought it was a really nice post, and he wrote it earlier this year. And it accurately describes what I've seen in many relationships, companies, communities, where you have like your company founded on values, or your community founded on some certain values, and then you let people into the community and they start to deviate from those values, and you don't correct them or reprimand them or anything. You just let it happen. And then since that person is now doing it, the next person that joins thinks it's normal, and so on and so forth. And eventually it becomes very normal. And I've seen that like partially because people are afraid to have the tough conversations and have confrontation, and partially because some people just don't care for the values of a community and they maybe shouldn't be involved in that community anymore if they're not going to change. So I thought it was a really good post that I'll link in the show notes.
Yeah.
I had not read that, but this is definitely what I've seen being involved in or adjacent to a lot of these kinds of issues over time is definitely like what I would say is like the political reality is not the one that is reflected in the supposed rules as written, basically. Like if the community has like a constitution or, some sort of like, here's the relationship between these things or here's how we do stuff. And then that drifts away from like what the actual reality is. Like some people are much more tolerant of like technically it says that, but this is the way that we do it around here. And then that becomes like a problem when there's like a conflict between the political reality wanting to do one thing and the sort of like more stated version of things to be something else. And then that like tends to cause the biggest problems here, I think, which is often about like soft power versus hard power, essentially. Like when one faction gains enough soft power to ignore the rules as written, that's when the biggest problems happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's we don't really prioritize. I mean, as an industry, we don't prioritize what are usually called soft skills, which are really just like, I don't know, human skills. But I think we have a big problem, especially in open source. But this happens in inside companies as well, with like, I think not really understanding the words that we're saying. Like we call them BDFL, benevolent dictator for life, and I'm like, I don't know, most of us live in countries that are supposedly democracies or attempting to be democracies and run on like more democratic ideals, which is really just saying run an ideal of like more people should be included in decision making, more people should have a voice, and people in power should be able to be checked by the people as a whole. And when we kind of run around as a group of people and we say, no, we don't want that version of things, and often say that version of things doesn't actually work. We say, well, no, we need this one person that will tell us everything that we should be doing. And that one person, we shall not speak ill of that person. And their decisions are obviously, we should always give them the most deference, and people that are detractors, we should look at them in the most negative light, which I think is how a lot of communities effectively operate in the open source world. It's like, yeah, things are not going to go well for a place where, like, I mean, one of the reasons dictatorships work in the real world is because those people do have an ability to control the area through force, usually of some sort. But there is no force in open source besides people basically willing to throw themselves into the meat grinder to get things done, because their love for the project outweighs their distaste for the chaos of leadership, which is just a real good way to burn people out.
There is one way in which there is force, though, which is things like GitHub permissions.
Yes, which we'll get into in a moment. We're
getting there. I know. But I'm just saying it's like not entirely true that there is no levers of power that are like actual, right. Comparing a button in a UI to like a military control of a physical space is maybe a bit of a stretch, but like, yes,
Right. And I mean, in a lot of ways, I don't want to get like too heavily political here, but like the ways that some of the experiences that people have that live in more autocratically run places, or even like oligarchic run places, like, there's debate about whether the US has an oligarchy or not, but like the quality of life that people have is generally not as good, very generally, as in places that are more like, democratic, which is to say like inclusive of more people. Really, we're just talking about like how many people are included in decision making at the end of the day. That's what a lot of this boils down to. And I think that like the quality of life for a lot of people in open source is pretty abysmal, but I don't think people connect that to like the fact that we do have such dictatorial ways of accomplishing things within our communities. And even though there's like those very small things of power, like as you mentioned, like permissions within GitHub, those wind up being like these kind of monumental things because we don't build enough to protect us from some of these more negative outcomes. But I for a while now, I found it very odd that people that outside, out of one part of their mouth will say, yeah, no, we really need to get money out of politics. We really need to make sure that like everybody's voting and we should vote. We should make voting mandatory so everybody participates, are then going to work or going to open source places and being like, no, one dude should just make all the decision. That runs better. That makes things work better. And I'm like, there's a cognitive dissonance here that I think we all need to start facing and being like, we can't. These two systems are too similar for us to be like, no, it'll work in one area, but it won't work in the other. But with that, I think we need to talk about the current crisis of leadership. I think that this one's a doozy. This one's a big doozy. So for you, viewer/listener that hasn't heard yet, there's some drama going on in the Ruby world, and it relates to what kind of feels like, on the one hand, some poor naming of some things. But I'll try to give like a very brief overview, and I'm sure Steve will be able to give a much better one. But my understanding of it is that the Ruby has this package management system or dependency management system called Ruby Gems, which is how you like get a lot of your libraries and dependencies you need for building your application. And then there's a tool that you use. I've never been in the Ruby ecosystem, so I'm not sure what part this tool plays, but it's called Bundler, and I feel like that's the tool that like helps you put together the Ruby gems or something like that, or gets them. I don't know. Steve, you'll correct me. But these two projects have been stewarded by some people in like a very open sourcey way. And quite recently, one company who I guess now runs, okay, so let's back up a bit. So there's this central place called rubygems.org, which is different from the Ruby Gems source code. It's the place where most people put their Ruby gems, put all these dependencies. And there's an organization that is in control of or in charge of running Ruby Gems. And recently, one of the contributors of money to that organization pressured some pretty big changes, including removing a whole bunch of people's permissions on GitHub, where this code is hosted, and basically taking over both the Ruby Gems website and the Ruby Gems and Bundler GitHub repositories by force. And it has caused a whole bunch of consternation and drama as a result from some very notable people, including DHH, who we'll get into in a moment. But Steve, please give a better overview of this situation.
So I need to first give a disclaimer, which is I am like a party to this conflict in several different ways, in the sense that I was on the board of an organization called Ruby Together, which got folded into Ruby Central, which is maybe one of the players you've heard about in this particular situation. Plus, I'm very close with the maintainer of Bundler and some of the people who were a little screwed over here. So I am definitely not a neutral observer. However, also, like I was on the board of that organization 10 years ago. And in some ways, this is a continuation of conflict from 10 years ago. So that's fun. But anyway, just general, Steve is not free of his own bias disclaimer here. So yeah, I mean, I think your summary is pretty good. I think there's some detail that maybe can make some things a little clearer, although it's funny to be like, here's a Charlie Day map of, and it'll be like, here's the connections between all of the things. But like, so Ruby in many ways pioneered a lot of the tooling that we take for granted in languages today. And so like one of the things that's a little interesting here is what you mentioned. I don't know what Bundler does. Basically like something like npm is like two separate tools in Ruby. So we had like Ruby Gems, which is like a command that you would run to just like install version 1.0 of this gem. Like that's what Ruby Gems does. And that was what it existed for a very long time. It's a very old tool. And so then eventually once like people wanted to start being able to like make more complicated, lists of like, here's all my stuff I need to install, like Bundler came along to be like, here is a file where you put in all the versions of all the gems that you want, and then we will resolve which versions are the ones that you actually want, and then write out a lock file, and then invoke Ruby gems to download all of those gems, and then put them in the right places and do that kind of work. So today, in many languages that have learned from this past, like those two tools are just one tool. But in Ruby, those are technically two different tools. Because of just like historically speaking, the second one was developed after the first one. And so like, plus also like in Ruby development, Ruby and Ruby gems are like much more historically closely connected. And so it was like easier to build a new tool on top of it as just some, people than it was to try to like integrate with the existing governance infrastructure. Cause it's just, I don't care about changing Ruby gems. I'm just trying to build a layer on top of it that allows me to manage stuff. And so that's like, historically speaking, it just was a more straightforward path, because also like these tools were very controversial when they first came out. There was a ton of people who did not like Bundler and still don't like Bundler and built their own smaller versions of Bundler. And like, it was like kind of much more, it was like less accepted of a way to do development basically when that was new. And so if it had been like put in upstream, that would have been a really big lift politically. Whereas like you can use this tool if you like it was much easier to like do. So they're historically like sort of separate in that ways. And so then also like you have Ruby gems, which is the program that downloads those gems and installs them. That's distributed with Ruby itself. So you get that with every Ruby install, you get a Ruby gems. But rubygems.org, the server side of that software, is where it would download those gems from. And so like that's also a piece of software. And so rubygems.org, Ruby gems, Ruby, and Bundler are all like technically maintained by different groups of people, although there is significant overlap between all of those groups of people. So that's like the first sort of like set of players in a strict, like this is the software sense. So Ruby Central is an organization that's been around for a very long time, and effectively they take money and donations to like help with the Ruby project in various ways. And so like historically, they also were involved in running some conferences. We're going to get into that because that is also ends up being involved in the situation. But like Ruby Central runs rubygems.org, the like website and domain, not like the source code, because they like pay, like they get in-kind donations for a lot of the like bills to run the software, but they also are kind of like sort of in charge of that as a thing. Like they're the ones that own the domain name and stuff. And so so there's kind of like that. So you have a situation where it's like a nonprofit is running a service, but it's built off of like an open source project that is sort of maintained by some of their employees and sponsors, but also by other people, essentially. So the conflict, like without getting into the motivation and backgrounds here, is effectively like the Ruby Central folks decided that they needed to be in charge of the source code for all of their projects, even though they historically have not. And so they convinced one of the maintainers for one of those projects to give them access on GitHub, and then they proceeded to remove everyone else's access from GitHub. And so that's like the inciting event of this particular like moment of the drama, was that because they effectively said like, well, we control this anyway, so we're just going to take it. And it's like, well, if you controlled it anyway, you would need to convince someone to give you the permissions because you weren't actually in control of it in the first place. But yeah, but that's the, I would say, like sort of overview of the facts without trying to get too much into the like opinions part. And there's still some facts I didn't cover as well. But like that's the rough shape of it anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, that is it's a lot. Some hostile takeover.
Yeah, and I made a joke earlier about WordPress because one very funny situation in this is that DHH, who was referenced a little bit ago, who we have not talked about his role in all this, but he posted back in those WordPress days, like, wow, this is really messed up in WordPress. This is kind of like if Ruby Central took over Ruby Gems from the community. Wouldn't that be f***ed up? And so here we are with that actually happening, sort of at DHH's request. So
yeah.
Because
I guess the other part of this is that So DHH sits on the board of Shopify.
Correct.
And Shopify is one of the big contributors to Ruby Central, and seems to, at least from my reading of this, have pressured Ruby Central into doing this takeover in some way. So like, once again, through the string wires and tax diagramming of this, it's kind of like, well, DHH seems to be sitting somewhere near the center of this whole situation unraveling, which is where there's that deep irony that, you know, he was so critical of what happened with WordPress and Matt Mullenweg. But then when it's happening, then it turns out he's doing the thing in his community, which, I mean, LOL, who could have seen that coming? Like,
Yeah.
It seems to be a thing that tends to happen quite a lot of people in glass houses throwing stones, you know, that whole thing. So, yeah, I think this situation is definitely, I feel like, one of the more egregious leadership betrayal. I don't know if betrayal's the right word, but just leadership, like abuses of power, seems.
Yeah, there's two ways to look at it. One of which is that way, and the other way to look at it is that like Ruby has never really been a democracy ever, but everybody pretends that it is. This kind of gets back to like what the actual norm versus not is. Like on some level, when the people in power do what they want, like the folks in power in Ruby have been doing whatever they want for like ever. So this is just the latest in a like, I don't really care what the community thinks. Like even within Rails itself, like David has been very clear for the entire time that he makes Rails for himself first and for everyone else second. And so he's made many like unpopular decisions because people are like, well, the community wants something else. And he's like, I don't care because this is like for me and I'm building the thing I want for me. So like he's still in charge after all these years, after having said that and having after done those things. So on one sense, this is like a pretty egregious breach of trust for the community because like people shouldn't be able to do whatever they want. But on the other hand, Ruby community has been letting DHH do whatever he wants forever. So like,
right.
You know, on some level, like he should be able to do this because that's just the way stuff has always been run, and it sucks and it should be different, but like it's not. And so that's also another like sort of way to look at it basically.
Yeah. The divergence that isn't really a divergence from the norms of us believing that we are existing in one type of space when it's actually this completely other system.
Yeah, I was going to say, this isn't a normalization of deviance. This was how it was defined from the get-go and how it always been, which, like you said, that does suck, but it's not new.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that gets me too, is I think people, it's like the discomfort with the realities of like how we run things. It's like, I'd be less annoyed if we all did just recognize that, yeah, no, all of these software projects are, in fact, they are autocratic. There is just one dude in charge, and that's just what we're all going to have to live with, and we're going to build our entire ecosystems on top of a bunch of, you know, dictators running around doing what they want. But I think the other problem with that is then, like, if you say that to a business, like, that maybe wants to use that software, like, hey, yeah, there's just one dude that if he just wakes up in a bad mood, he could like tank all of your software because what he built is at the core of what you do. That's likely intolerable for most businesses. They'd be like, I know we're getting this for free, but any legal department or finance department that looks at that or hears about that would be like, oh, you're not using that software. Like any sensible leader in a company would be like, oh yeah, we're not using that thing. So to some degree, I think we have to have this illusion that like there's foundations, there's all of these people, there's all of these checks and balances that just do not exist in practical reality. And I feel like that also was one of the things that gets people into this meat grinder that is open source, is people being like, oh, but look how you can have an impact. Look how you can get involved and do all of this stuff, when it's like, yeah, but you're not getting compensated for any of that. And then when push comes to shove, you don't have a voice in this. And there is the thing that people always say, like, oh, well, you can always fork it. I like that works in some communities. Like, obviously, of all of the communities we just talked about, I feel like Node.js is the one that is the most democratic because they did fork multiple times when they were upset with leadership. They were like, nah, we're going to go over here and we're going to put the time, energy, and effort behind getting the heck away from you because we don't like what you're doing. I think that's one of the reasons why Node has, been able to flourish in the way it has, is because they have been able to be like, no, we're going to go do what we want. We want what our community wants. We get what you want, leader, but that's not what we want. So we're going to go over here. And if you're going to keep ignoring us, then we're just going to go fork and we're going to go do our own thing.
And importantly, as you said, following through on doing the thing. There have been tons of times in other places where people are like, we're forking. And then they click the fork button and then don't do anything because everyone expects that everyone else is going to do the work.
Right. And there's definitely a couple, like this also happened in the Drupal community when there was a big, going from Drupal 7 and Drupal 8, there was a group of people that were like, but we actually like Drupal 7. We don't want these changes to go through. And they fought them for a long time. But when it was very clear that they had lost, they didn't just like stick around the community and be like toxic and mean or whatever. They just forked Drupal 7 and then made Backdrop, and they made their own thing. And I think Backdrop is still going, but that was like a very healthy split because it allowed the community to like peacefully like segment, and the people that wanted the Drupal 7 thing could go keep using Drupal 7, and the people that wanted the new stuff could go use the new stuff. Of course, it did take talking about long times. I think Drupal 7 just got killed this year, and it came out in like 2009 or something like that, 2010, and around that era. So maybe a little bit later, but it took like a good decade to wind that down, and a good, because like Drupal 8 came out, I think in 2015 maybe. So it took like a decade after the next thing came out. I think in this case, Drupal 8 got killed before Drupal 7 did, which is just like, shows you what a big shift it was from those two things. But it is an example of like a healthy split. And I feel like the PHP community is another community that is very embracing of those splits and those forks and whatnot.
Backdrop had a commit 5 days ago.
Yeah. People are still working on it. But these other communities, I think, have the dictator problem, the cognitive dissonance of those in the community. And I think that leads to a question I think we've asked a lot on this podcast, which is like, none of this seems sustainable in the long term. Like, I don't know how many people you can throw into a meat grinder that just burns you out over the course of a number of years and then be able to keep maintaining it. I feel like part of it is unfair to solely blame the leaders for this problem. It's in the same way that it's like people really want to blame their politicians for why things aren't going well. And it's like, I think both in the case of these leaders, but definitely politicians, it's like, well, they run on feedback, so they'll do something.
Both are true at the same time, which is kind of wild, but it is true. And that's why it's important to talk to your entire community as much as possible to see like what is the gauge of, the whole community, not just the ones that like me or not just the ones that hate me. Like, what's the gauge of the entire community? And that's hard to do.
On some level too, like as much as we've been talking about leadership, as I brought up before, it's like it's about the whole system. I think like DHH is the type of person that's just like, if you don't like me, I don't care. Like, don't use Rails then. Which I think is better than the people that try and be like, we should be inclusive of everybody. Like, I think that's also like one of the issues I have with the way that we tend to run open source projects is like, to some degree, the people that are like these kind of, I would say certainly toxic leaders, kind of stand their ground about, this is just who I am. This is what I want. I'm not going to change. If you don't like it, then you can get out. At least that's super clear. Whereas I think like, especially the spread of codes of conduct, which we also did a whole episode about, like that is trying to say a little bit of the opposite of being like, no, we really want you to be here, but we're still going to mistreat you, and we're going to erect things that seem to protect you that are actually weapons against you, and then we're going to tell you to your face, no, that's not a bad thing against you. Like, if we're gonna have bad leadership, I'd rather be a bad leadership that just says to your face what they're gonna do and is actually upfront about it, than people that attempt to like really just like psychologically manipulate you so that they can feel better about themselves. It's like that problem with racism where like a lot of white people would rather be racist than be called racist. Like they don't have a problem with being racist, but if you point out that they're doing a racist thing, that's when they have the big problem. And I think that's how a lot of people in a lot of these open source spaces is it's like, no. I know we're having all of this talk about using autocracy to run everything, but we're not really autocratic. We're really a big democracy. I mean, how can we not be? We're not paying people and they're still helping us, right? But it's like, no, that's kind of disingenuous. That's you not understanding how the system works or how any of this works. Because once again, you might not be paying them directly, but somebody might, and their livelihood might actually depend on the software that you're creating. So there might be actual pressures. And there's also all the social pressures of like, yo, this is your community. This is where your friends are. Are you just going to pick up and leave that to go somewhere new where you don't know anybody? Because one dude is acting really annoying. A lot of people will put up with a lot of stuff because the other things around them are more worth it than dropping everything. There's a certain amount of pressure that has to build up before someone will actually leave a community.
Yeah.
I mean, like I don't have skin in either of these games, like the Linux or the Rails stuff. So to me, I also don't care, but I'm also not. I don't use Rails. I'm not in the community like that. I don't care about DHH in that regard. I like what he's doing for the Linux community in the sense of like the Omarchy stuff that we talked about in a previous episode. I like that that's getting. I like when people use Linux more, and that's great. But like, I don't know him. Right? Like I don't know this person personally. I see some of his writings. Some of them I like, some of them I don't like, right? Like the cloud repatriation stuff and the costs of moving off the cloud. I thought those are great. Those are really nice to see. I want to see more of that stuff. And then like the ones that are, edging on racism and all that other stuff, I don't like them as much. But at the same time, I can understand why he's writing them. Like I can understand why you visit Cuba and the people love Cuba. And they have no idea, like they're under a big dictatorship and whatever. I can understand it, so I can understand why people write from these perspectives, even if I agree with them or not. But I don't know, in this case, what's the path forward, right? Like I guess my question is really, what's the problem and what's the path forward? Well, like is the problem DHH and we should eliminate him from the Rails community and Ruby community, or like is the problem that there exists no other thing to rival Rails? Like, well, what is the actual core problem here in the Ruby case, not the Ruby Central one, but the DHH case?
I think it's so. I don't know if it's just isolated to Ruby and DHH, but I think part of the problem is that like no one, and this is like a problem with companies too, is that people don't really state what their goals are, so you don't have a good way of tracking against it. Like companies do this all the time. They're like, look at our great earnings. And it's like one of the few things the stock market does well. So it's just like, yeah, but what were your expected earnings? We're not just being like, oh, you made $1 billion, so you're good. Like if you made $1 billion and you're expecting to make 500 million, that's great. If you made $1 billion but you're expecting to make 10 billion, that's not great. So you can't just take these numbers objectively. I think that's the same thing with these communities. It's like, what is it that you care about at the end of the day? Are we as an industry saying that we would like to build software in a sustainable way that burns out as few people as possible and like does psychological harm to as few people as possible? Because if that's the goal, then we are abysmally failing at that. And we need to make a lot of corrections to fix that. But if the goal is we just want to produce a bunch of free software we can give to other people, then I don't think there is a problem, right? It's like, if the end goal, if the thing that we're trying to do at the end of the day is just do open source, make free software because we think free software is great, then I don't think that there is any correction that we need to make, because we are very successfully making a whole crap load of free software to give to everybody. But again, the cost of that is pretty high. And the way that that software gets made is pretty egregious. And like in some levels, like, it's inhumane, some of the things that people have to go through to be part of these communities or to build stuff. Even prominent people, the things that they go through. Like in this case, there's a very particular person who's being very obviously targeted by this whole Ruby Central thing. And it's like, well, what did that person do? Did they do anything? Probably not. But like, that one person's being targeted. And we had a similar thing happen to the Go community when Peter Bragan got completely targeted and banned out of the community for life. And it's like, okay, but like, if you look at the whole picture, it's like, oh, you just went after like that one dude, because that one dude was like the opposition and pushing back on you. And it's like, do we want to be that type of community? Do we want to have that type of regime where it's like, no, you aren't allowed to speak up about things? No, it's like, and is that going to lead to the best software that we can have? I don't know. But like, I think we as communities need to state what it is that we care about. And the thing is, people are unwilling to do that. They don't want to sit down and they don't want to do that thought. That's why we fall into these dictatorships, because it's like, it's just easier to have someone make a decision. Same thing at companies. The reason we have these wonky hierarchical structures is because it's hard to sit down and plan out a company structure that doesn't have this default hierarchy, right? Oh, there's a hierarchy. Well, you just have all these positions. Everybody else is doing it, so we can just do it. But sitting down and doing something new, like what Oxide is doing, where it's just flat, there's a lot of stuff you have to figure out. And it's a lot less tolerant to a lot of things too. Like, you can't have communication breakdown if you have a flat org, like you can when you have a hierarchy, right? The blast radius of poor communication is just way too wide in a flat org. So you have to figure out, well, how do we do communication better? Which often leads to tough conversations like, oh, we got to actually hire people that know how to make communication a bit better. We got to hire people that know how to do knowledge management better. We have to hire people that know how to do leadership better. And then it's like, well, where do we find those people? And, oh, well, we could be hiring engineers instead of that. And so there's a whole conversation that people just don't want to engage in and don't want to have. And that's why everything winds up the way it is.
I mean, there's definitely a power dynamic aspect to it too. Like you were saying, the hierarchy versus flat. And I've seen it at Oxide where the way we talk to each other generally, I mean, there's obviously disagreements and nothing's perfect, but the way we talk to each other generally is a peer-to-peer basis, where it's like, I'm not higher or lower than Steve and Steve's not higher or lower than me, right? Like we talk to each other that way. And that doesn't exist in a lot of companies and in a lot of open source communities. Who's going to really talk against, Linus or DHH to that level? Because they're not peers, right? There is like a top-down relationship there where they're the benevolent dictator for life and you just do what they say essentially. And like, you're right. That is not a great position to be in. And I think it's one of the reasons why adults act like children in the open source communities in so many ways, because they never really grew those muscles of how to communicate effectively. So you snap to some extent, right? You only can take so much of being frustrated before you snap and say to someone like, oh, you suck, I hate you. Like, that's going to happen because you're never letting people communicate effectively normally. So it's just going to build up over time and then eventually just come out in a bad way. And then that's where it's easy to look at that and be like, oh, Matt, you just spoke up against, Linus or something or DHH and you said mean things. I'm going to ban you. It's like, well, okay, that wasn't the solution. Something happened before that you totally missed, but it's fine. And I think we just do that again and again, and we call ourselves like, we're doing great in the community. We're banning the bad people. It's like, why was that person so bad to begin with? Or why did Matt get so mad to begin with? Like, what happened? That's the real problem. That's just like Matt being angry was just a symptom. And yeah. There's no right answer here. I'm just pointing out the fact that communication is difficult and we don't encourage practicing it well in companies and in open source communities.
Yeah.
Like,
I also.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna make one more thing. Like, I've made comments in certain communities of like, oh, I don't like the way Go does this, or I don't like the way Linux does that, and the community gets on you. Like, how dare you speak against our Lord and Savior Go? It's like, well, you don't have criticisms either? Like, what do you mean? It's not perfect. Come on. We should be able to discuss these things. And that is that's a frustrating experience.
Yeah. I feel like it's just like, we're definitely not all existing in a healthy environment. And I think that's like the biggest thing here is like, we could be building all of this software and we could all just be getting along. Like, there are ways that you can disagree with people without being toxic or without having hostility. And I think that's such a foreign concept to people. Like I was thinking about it the other day, how like I have like 4 really, really, really close friends, like my best friends, and I have a whole bunch of like other friends. And like I was thinking about it and I was like, I don't think I've ever gotten to like a screaming match or yelling with my close friends. Like we've never yelled at each other. We've disagreed about plenty of stuff in plenty of different ways, but we never like yelled at each other. We've never like done ad hominem attacks. We've never like done the toxic, nasty stuff that people do when they disagree. And it's just like I think a lot of people frame it as like, oh, they're just passionate or that's just how they express love. But it's like, no, that's just toxic. You don't have to exist in that way. You can exist in a healthy way, and you can still have the full range of like, wow, we just severely disagree about this topic. We're like at opposite ends of it. But I think people just have the assumption that, oh, well, this is just how things have to be, because this is just how things are is everywhere. Like you could look at this and say, well, all of these language communities are having this problem. So clearly this is just part of the way that things work, which like doesn't allow you to advance or to, as we like to say, innovate. Right. I think that's perhaps that's the root of this, where like we say we want to be a community and an industry that innovates. And like innovation doesn't come out of effectively suppressing and oppressing people. Like that's not how that works. Like we know that's not how that works. So it's like, okay, yeah, we can have these BDFLs, but you're giving up innovation. Like that's why I think a lot of these things, like they have a big spike and then the BDFL gets really comfortable with what they're doing and doesn't want to rock the boat, doesn't want to change things, and then everything stagnates for a bit or for a really long time. Like I think that's part of the reason too why Rails became like definitely, I don't know if it's irrelevant, but it's definitely not as relevant as it used to be, because like the whole world around Rails was also changing, and I think other things just caught up and overtook, because you know Rails had one dude that was trying to do innovation, where a lot of other communities have a whole bunch of people doing innovation. Like even in the PHP world, right? Like there are many different extremely popular frameworks and library systems. And like there's been consolidation, like there's consolidation around Symfony now. Like I think most things like Drupal and Laravel and like a whole bunch of other stuff uses the different components of basically what is the standard library of PHP, which is called Symfony. But like there's still tons of innovation. There's still a lot of flourishing because it's a whole bunch of different people exploring different things that they want to do. And when you have like a single leader, it's much harder to do that, especially a single leader that wants to squash dissent, because then the way that you get to people doing different things is via dissent. They're like, I disagree with the way you're doing this particular thing. I want to explore doing it in a different way. So I think that's probably the biggest thing of like, we cannot simultaneously be an industry of people that innovates and be an industry of people that's run by autocracy. So that's one of the cognitive dissonance things that I think people have to give up on, right? Yeah, we can keep running our communities like this. We can keep having these people that aren't really good leaders leading, but you're giving up on innovation. And I think we've seen it through this whole industry. We have a really tough time innovating.
I really like your point about writing down the goals of the community, the project too. Not a lot of places do that. Or at least if they do that, they don't write them down. They like just say them in passing. And then they're like, don't you remember when I said I made this for myself and not for you? It's like, well, you never really wrote that down anywhere. So no, I don't remember.
If you write it down, you can be held accountable to it. If you write it down, that gives your dissenters the ability to be like, hey, you wrote this down and you're not doing it. So how about we start doing it? And then really a lot of this comes down to about people themselves, right? They don't like having to confront the cognitive dissonance that exists. They want to believe two things that cannot be simultaneously true at the same time. Like they really want to embrace all of that. And like some amount of that is fine. If you're aware that you're doing that, I think it's fine. But I think it's the lack of awareness. Once again, there's a lot of people that sit down and they're like, wow, codes of conduct are great. We want to be inclusive of everybody. And I'm like, it's not possible to be inclusive of everybody. I mean, you look at codes of conduct in practice, they exclude the very people that you claim you want to include. So you gotta go resolve that. And most people are just like, but no, we wrote the thing down, so it shouldn't be a problem. It's like, well, that's not how it works. Sorry.
Human's human.
People don't like confronting that. They don't like dealing with that.
I know we're almost at the time for this episode. There's the Nix thing. We want to cover that.
Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
we could do this really briefly because also it's important because these things are becoming connected. And this is one of the things I want to say is like, what should we do? And it's like, well, I'm not in the Ruby community, so it's not my job to do anything or whatever, right? It's like really what path they want to chart in this situation. But the trick here is because of for those who have not heard, the Nix situation is basically like the moderation team has quit Nix over concerns of stuff, and this is a conflict that has been running for a little over a year, if not slightly longer. And basically it boils down to a couple different players in the ecosystem that people are like uncomfortable with, and then not being happy with the way that the governance is working, both in a practical sense and also in a philosophical sense, because a lot of this is about Endurial, and also about the BDFL's company, which is also partially related to the Endurial stuff. And so people are upset about all that.
What name is that?
The defense contracting company.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Defense contracting.
The way you said it, I thought it was a different, like, I've always heard it called Andoril. So I didn't, when you said
I only read Lord of the Rings.
Saying...
I don't actually hear it spoken. So sure. You probably actually know better than me in this situation. Yes. I do mean that company named after a sword from Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
You know, yes.
Sorry, I was not making fun of your...
No, it's cool. I was forced to read as a child. I don't know how to pronounce words. It's fine. That's how it goes.
I was like, is he talking about a different company or no?
Yeah. But anyway, the point is that DHH is expressly now trying to connect this situation to other ones in like a anti-woke backlash of like, we are taking back software from the left. And so when you have like multiple of these situations, like then it becomes a cross community issue, because it's being like presented as this like a wave of difference from what has come before. And so on one level, it's like, yeah, I don't have any dog in this Ruby fight because like I'm not part of the Ruby community anymore. And so like, while I hate to see my friends suffering, like it's not really my job to try to fix this because I'm like not a part of that community. And so it's really like up to the community to deal with things. But then once this like these macro trends happen, it becomes a little more complicated, because it becomes more of a broader ideological battle than it just simply like what is happening in one community versus another. So yeah,
that is another interesting aspect of this. Of like, I like how you brought up that like DHH has always wanted to be contrarian, and then he's now found himself in the spot where he is now it's the thing of like, he always wanted to be the underdog and now he's the incumbent, and he really does not like being the incumbent, because if you're the incumbent and things are not going well, that is your fault. Mm-hmm. So he's attempting, and I think a lot of people are attempting to like take this whole idea of like anti-wokeness, which is just such a silly phrase, and like be like, oh yeah, this is the problem, is that all of this is woke. And I'm like, how is it all like, this is all white dudes that made all of this? Like, where is the wokeness? Where is this is all people like you that have made all of this stuff. Where is you did this, and now you're mad that it sucks because you did it, and now you're like, we got to undo it somehow. And I'm like, this is not making any. Ironically, this is not compute, even though your whole job is a computing professional. Like, yeah, I think that's a whole other aspect of things that we can get into in break, which is the after show.
Yeah, we should do that.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, like, thank you all for both of you for talking about this stuff. I had no idea about a lot of this drama. Like, I didn't I lived through the Python 2.3 thing where like I wasn't in the community, but I was using Python and I heard people talking about it. And I was like, oh, this kind of sucks. Like, this is this doesn't feel good. And I've seen a lot of these things happen from the sidelines, and I've only ever been a part of it, certain parts of it. But it's nice to like hear all of this stuff and talk about it without like yelling at one another.
Yeah, and that's the tough thing is like, once you become one of the olds, you have to go through, and really people don't like actually like documenting everything that happened, because this is like modules.
That's the thing. That's the approach I'm coming from, is like, I like this from an educational knowledge perspective. I like to learn. I'm not trying to stir up drama and gossip. That's not the point of this. It's to like inform, document, and be like, hey, what actually happened here? Let's talk about it. Because I didn't know half of this stuff. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, Kris.
But I think it's because, it's the same thing with, I didn't really think about it till I wrote down this list of things, and I was like, wow, so many languages have made this same stupid mistake. We've done the same thing. And then the one time we didn't do it, people are still mad. Like, I think what is it we said last episode? We were like, you can't be mad all the time. Like, you can't always be mad.
Issue. Yes, you can.
That's my secret. What am I, Bruce Banner?
Yeah.
But no, it's like I think people do sit down and they just don't. We don't document our history enough. I mean, we certainly don't document histories cross communities. Like, I think that's one other problem. Like, if you are someone that's, in a programming language community right now that is considering doing like a Python 2 to 3-esque sort of thing, if you're not in the Python community or in the PHP or the Perl or any of the other communities that have done this, like, it might just look like, oh, well, they just did one thing poorly and that's why it got messed up. And it's like, no, there's a whole bunch of context and nuance around all of this about why these things happen the way they did. And there's never a singular person to blame. I think even in the course of this episode, which, as is true of many episodes we do, I started with an initial premise of like, clearly these are just bad leaders. But now I'm much more of a place of, this is just a whole bunch of people having way too much cognitive dissonance that we need to resolve, because it's not just bad leaders. I mean, I think DHH is a very poor leader, but I think that's because he doesn't care about being a good leader. He doesn't want to be a good leader. He wants to be a contrarian underdog who can just shout at people all the time. Like, that's what he wants to do and who he wants to be. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. If you know what you want to be, dude, go do that. And you can have your fun little playground for people who like you to go play over there. And like a bunch of us will go over here and hopefully build a better version of the world that we also want to align with, that aligns with our values. That said, I still do not like DHH. I don't like what they did at 37 Signals. Like, we're not going to talk about politics here. I'm like, oh, you're not going to talk about anybody but your politics here. Okay, we got it. But hey, I think there was a Subway take. Never going to be able to find it. But so there's a show where a dude sits on the subway and talks to people, kind of speaking to a Metro card with a microphone clipped on it. Excellent show. But there was one, and he like asked people for like, oh, what's your take? And someone said, bring back segregation. And he was just like, what? 100% disagree. And they're like, no. And the person was like, no, I want to know where I'm not welcome. Like, I want you to put a sign up saying I'm not welcome here. So we're just all clear about where you don't want me to be. And then I just won't go there. And I feel like that's kind of what, DHH does in a way. So he puts a big sign up that are like, I don't know, if you like liberal and progressive ideology, don't come here. It's like, okay, great. Then we don't have to pretend. None of us have to pretend that you're like a place that does like those things and embraces those ideas when you don't. I think more people should be sticking their ground on like, this is what we actually do care about. And hey, if that's his view of anti-wokeness, if his view of anti-wokeness is like wokeness is this thing where people say one thing but do another, then like, sure, I guess we do agree that I don't want that. Like, if anti-wokeness is like, let's get rid of these codes of conduct because they suck, sure. I mean, I'd like to replace it with something that's a bit more robust that can actually solve the problems we're having. That once again, just making it very clear. This is who we want in our community. This is who we don't want in our community. So, it would be real ironic if I wound up agreeing with DHH. But I'm sure if we did agree, it'd be from completely opposite directions. But hey, who knows? But this is what this podcast is about, right? It's about having those deep, nuanced conversations about things and about changing your mind, or at least advancing your view of things. That's why I like doing it. And having people that we don't get in screaming matches about. None of us yelled.
That's why we schedule these in the morning, where we don't have, we're still getting up.
Like, we don't have the energy to yell.
Yeah.
All right. So before we go to break, God, what a good name. I'm good at naming things. I don't know what this computer science hard thing is. I'm good at naming things. Anyway, before we go to that, any last words? I feel like we don't need to do unpopular opinions or panic and recover, because there were lots of unpopular opinions in this episode, I feel.
Yeah. I think we're good.
Okay. So any last words from you before we go to the after show?
Not really. Thanks for having me on again, really. I guess. Stuff is hard. Turns out people are hard. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, just, don't be afraid to speak up. and give feedback obviously in a kind way, not overly kind either. You need to be genuine, but like, don't be afraid to hold people to the accountability standards that they set.
For sure. And with that, listener / viewer, yeah, go listen to Break. There's a link to it in the show notes. So
we're about to break.
So, listener, viewer, how'd you like that episode? It was a little bit of a longer one. We've been trending shorter recently, but this topic needed a lot of discussion, I think, to really get that nuance out. So, do you agree with what we said? Do you not agree with what we said? Either way, leave us some commentary. You can hit us up on social media or in the comments below. This episode of Fall Through was hosted by Kris Brando with co-hosts Matthew Sanabria and Steve Klabnik. Fall Through is produced by Kris Brando and Angelica Hill, and our beats are by Breakmaster Cylinder.